Now, I just want you to think about the world that we live in, the world that we live in here in Danville, Illinois, and to think about James' phrase, consider it pure joy, brothers, when you face tests, when you face trials. And those trials could mean different things. It could mean the loss of a job. It could mean a layoff that you're facing at work. It could mean difficulties within the family. Maybe you're having a struggle between your wife, or maybe you're, as parents, are having a struggle with your kids, or as a parent, or as a kid, you're having a struggle with your parents. Whatever it might be, it could be the diagnosis of cancer or AIDS or some other, major diagnosis that comes to our lives. And it doesn't even have to be about us. It could be about a loved one. Those are tests that come in this life. There are trials that come into each life. And James says that we're to consider it pure joy. Now let me just ask you this. How insane is that? I mean, honestly, how insane is that? In the world that we live in, at least, the world that wants to put a positive slant on everything that we deal with, James says, when you face trials and testing, consider it pure joy. That's kind of insane. And honestly, we should see it in that way, because as Christians, we're supposed to live differently. We said that Jesus came to turn the world upside down, and the things that the world looks as bad news as good news. It's kind of like that old hee-haw thing, Oh, that's bad. No, that's good. Oh, that's good. No, that's bad. And that's kind of what Jesus brings into the mix. The world would tell you that you don't like negative things, but James says, consider it pure joy when you face trials of many kinds. I mean, we live in a world, John Ortberg says, we live in a world that we just don't like negative terms. People are no longer fired. We let them go. Right? I mean, factories don't talk about this anymore. Downsizing, they talk about right-sizing. Because everything needs to have a positive slant. No one is bald anymore, and poor Terry Goodner is not here to defend himself. But no one's bald anymore, they're follically challenged. Or someone said comb-free. You have to put a positive slant. We don't buy used cars anymore. They're no longer used cars because, after all, we couldn't buy anything that's used. They are pre-owned, certified vehicles. Everything has to have this positive slant in this nation that we live in. And yet James says to us, consider it pure joy, brothers, when you face trials of many kinds. And then he goes on to explain why. In verse 3, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. And so the very first reason that James tells us that we face trials is because it produces patience. It produces patience in us. Now, we don't like to talk about patience. In fact, most Christians I talk to say, oh, don't you ever pray for patience, because if you pray for patience, that means that some trial is going to come. But see, that seems to be backwards to me. It seems to be backwards to what the Scriptures teach. It seems to be backwards to what James is presenting this morning. James says that the trials in our lives bring about patience. And we have to have patience. We must have perseverance. We don't like to exercise that much anymore. I try from time to time to exercise patience. I will pick the longest line from time to time. I'm not saying all the time. From time to time, I will pick the longest line just simply to exercise a little bit of patience. Why? Because he goes on to say that patience builds within us. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature. See, if we're ever to grow up in our faith, then we have to go through trials, which produces patience, which produces maturity. You guys know that. It's the only way that we grow. Riker right now is going through a stage where he has been crawling. He's about ready to walk. And you know what's going to happen when he walks? He's going to fall down. And do you know what Riker will do when he falls down? He will get back up again. Children know this. Children just automatically go through it. But there's something about coming to faith in Jesus Christ, especially in this nation, where we lose track of the fact that we are going to suffer because of our belief. This isn't foreign to other nations. We were just at Hanging Rock last night for the dinner, and I was listening to some conversations that were going on with a couple of missionaries. There are two young men who are seniors at Great Lakes Bible College right now, but they are originally from Zimbabwe. One of these young men, I think his name was Taka, whose brother is a teacher in Zimbabwe. And as a teacher in Zimbabwe, he makes $150 a month. $150 a month. See, other places in the world, people who have a belief in Jesus Christ understand that there may be suffering. In fact, Carol Finley shared an illustration about a church that they were worshiping at last week. They were out of town, and they were worshiping over near Galena. And in it, it was a live feed. The minister stopped the live feed, said, stop the recording, stop the feed right now. Because he went on to talk about a mission trip that they were going to be taking, where they were going to teach in a Muslim country, to teach Muslim people, Muslim Christians, Muslim-raised people who are now believers in Jesus Christ. They were going to teach them how to reach their families and their friends. And the reason that he stopped the tape is because in today's world, the internet, there's no guarantee that people there wouldn't have gotten that message. And so when they went, they would be putting others in danger by being there. See, what I want you to understand is that there are people around the world who understand that their faith in Jesus Christ may indeed cost them dearly. It may cost them everything that they have, and they consider it joy. Because they know that they must endure those trials, that they might become patient, that they might become mature, that they might grow up in their faith. If there's any reason in this nation that we don't have mature believers in Jesus Christ, or more mature believers, let me put it that way, it's because we so often refuse to face our trials and to allow them to do the work within us. A third thing that I believe is a purpose of the trials that God brings to our lives is that it brings wisdom. It offers wisdom. Look at verse 13. See, until you truly understand that God brings the trial into your life for a reason, you can't understand what he's stating in verse 13. In verse 13, he says, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he is dragged away and enticed. And then he goes on to talk about, just like with joy, just like with the patience that God wants to build within us, just like there's a system, there's a growth that takes place. He says here that there's a growth that takes place when sin takes hold. When the devil gets a foothold in your heart, there is a progression that takes place, and that progression is that it will begin to just take hold in your life. And before you know it, according to verse 15, before you know it, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. And so there's a growth that takes place for those who don't embrace their trials either, and it's in reverse. We grow farther and farther away from God. And so here he tells us that it's not God's fault that we're going through these things. And it sounds like a contradiction, but it's two different usages of the word.